December 19th, 1944. A gray winter light leaked through shattered windows of a converted French army barracks in Verdun. Inside, the air was thick with cigarette smoke, the bitter smell of coffee, and something heavier, fear. Around a long wooden table sat the most powerful generals in the Allied command. Music map folders lay open. Pencils were clenched in tired fingers. Ashtrays overflowed. Not a single man in that room was smiling. 3 days earlier, over 200,000 German soldiers had slammed into the American lines in the Ardennes forest. The blow had come out of nowhere. Music. Allied intelligence had assured everyone that Germany was exhausted, incapable of major offensive action. Yet now, American units were being overrun, music surrounded, and in some cases simply erased from the map. Reports of shattered regiments and broken communication lines piled up faster than anyone could read them. Somewhere out there, the 101st Airborne was surrounded in a small Belgian town called Bastogne. If that town fell, German armor could tear a hole straight through the Allied front, split the armies in two, and perhaps drive all the way to the coast. At the head of the table sat Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander. He studied the map spread before him, red and blue arrows stabbing into the Ardennes like wounds. The room buzzed with low murmurs until Eisenhower raised his head. His voice, when he spoke, cut through the tension. He asked one question, the question every man there had been silently dreading. How soon, he demanded. Could someone attack north to relieve Bastogne? Silence fell like a curtain. Generals stared down at their maps and notes, minds racing through impossible calculations. Music, distances, fuel, ammunition, road capacity, winter music storms. Units already locked in combat to disengage entire formations, turn them around in freezing weather, and hurl them into a new battle on short notice. It was the kind of logistical nightmare war colleges used as hypothetical exercises. No one wanted to be the first to answer. Then George S. Patton spoke. I can attack with 2 divisions in 48 hours. Heads snapped toward him. Some officers blinked in disbelief. A few thought he must be joking. Music trying to impress Eisenhower with yet another bold claim. 48 hours to disengage multiple divisions from active combat. Wheel an entire army 90°, move more than 100,000 men and thousands of vehicles over frozen narrow roads, then attack into prepared German positions. It was beyond optimistic. It sounded operationally insane. Every experienced commander in that room knew the scale of what he was promising and knew it shouldn't be possible. But Patton's face was calm, his tone matter of fact. There was no boast in his voice. He wasn't bluffing. He wasn't guessing. He was the only man in that room who had seen this coming and had quietly been preparing for it for 11 days. To understand why, you have to go back to December 9th, 1944, 10 days before the conference at Verdun. In Nazi France, the headquarters of the U.S. Third Army was busy with routine matters of an army on the offensive. Patton's forces were pushing toward Germany, planning further advances into the Saar region. On the surface, everything pointed toward eventual Allied victory. The German army seemed to be collapsing bit by bit, and most senior commanders believed the war in Europe might be over soon. Colonel Oscar Call, Patton's G2, the officer responsible for intelligence, music, saw something different. That day, Koch walked into Patton's office carrying an armful of reports, maps, and decoded signals. Cole was not a man of theatrics. He was meticulous, analytical, and cautious. But there was urgency in his eyes as he spread his documents across Patton's desk. For weeks, he had been monitoring German troop movements all along the Western Front, and a disturbing pattern had emerged. 15 German divisions had vanished. These weren't skeleton units or battered remnants. They were full-strength divisions, including several panzer formations, with hundreds of tanks. They had been withdrawn from the line, but no one at Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, SHA, seemed to know exactly where they had gone. When Coe raised the alarm, the official explanation was simple and dismissive. Those divisions were being held in reserve to counter any future Allied breakthroughs. Nothing to worry about. Coe didn't agree. He had spent months studying how the Wehrmacht operated. Holding such a large force simply in reserve did not match their usual patterns. This wasn't a defensive posture. This was offensive strength, a hammer waiting to music fall. He traced lines on the map with his pencil, showing Patton where he believed the missing divisions were concentrating. He pointed to the Ardennes. The Ardennes sector was thinly held by American forces. 4 divisions were stretched across a front that should have required at least 12. The terrain, music was terrible for defenders and attackers alike. Dense forests, ravines, and narrow, twisting roads that became treacherous in winter. That was precisely why WWII intelligence was relaxed about it. No sane commander, they argued, would choose to launch a massive offensive through that terrain in Music December. Coe reminded Patton of an uncomfortable fact. In 1940, the Germans had done exactly that. They had driven through the Ardennes, smashed the French and British armies, and reached the English Channel in about 6 weeks. The terrain that seemed to guarantee safety had once before been the gateway to disaster. Coe's evidence didn't end there. Radio traffic in the sector had spiked. Prisoners of war spoke of new units arriving behind the lines. Local civilians reported increased German activity, convoys at night, more patrols, the sounds of armor moving under cover of darkness. Piece by piece, the picture sharpened. Patton listened, his expression hardening as Coe laid out his case. Then he asked the key question. If you're right, when do they attack? Coe didn't hesitate. Based on movement patterns and timing, he estimated that the offensive would begin within the next 2 weeks. Patton picked up the phone and called General Omar Bradley, his immediate superior. He presented Coe's assessment clearly. Missing panzer divisions, suspicious movements, the weak American line in the Ardennes. Bradley heard him out, but remained unconvinced. Shaw intelligence disagreed. They believed Germany simply didn't have the strength left for a hammer blow. The war, they insisted, was in its final phase. Bradley advised Patton not to worry. Patton put the receiver down slowly and looked back at Coe. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he gave a simple order. Start planning from that moment on. While Third Army continued to attack in Thesar, a secret effort began behind the scenes. Patton's staff, under Coach's guidance, drew up 3 detailed contingency plans for a rapid pivot, north in response to a German offensive in the Ardennes. The work was painstaking. Truck routes were charted down to specific roads and intersections. Fuel supplies were prepositioned where they could be quickly shifted. Artillery units were earmarked for fast redeployment. Infantry regiments were assigned exact assembly areas, staging points, and march tables. Timelines were calculated in hours. Every plan depended on precision and coordination on an almost unimaginable scale. They designated 3 possible scenarios. If the enemy drove in from one direction, Third Army would execute Plan A. If the situation developed differently, Plan B. If circumstances required another kind of response, Plan C. Each plan covered not just movements, but supply, communications, and the inevitable chaos of disentangling units from existing combat. Some of Patton's officers thought their commander had finally gone too far. Why divert time and energy to hypothetical emergencies 100 miles away, while they were actively fighting in another sector? Why plan to pull back from an advance they were winning? But they obeyed. They were Patton's men, and Patton trusted more than he trusted the rosy reports from higher headquarters. On December 12th, Patton gathered his senior commanders. He told them something they did not expect to hear: be ready to disengage from current operations on very short notice. He did not explain why. He didn't talk about missing German divisions or a possible offensive through the snow-covered forests. He simply told them to be prepared. There were exchanged glances and raised eyebrows. No one understood the full picture, but orders were orders. By December 15th, Third Army was uniquely positioned among Allied forces, while other commands focused solely on advancing in their own sectors and counting the days until Christmas. Patton's army alone had detailed plans ready to respond if the Ardennes exploded. At 5:30 a.m. on December 16, 1944, that explosion came. The stillness of the winter morning shattered as German artillery opened up along an 80-mile front. Thousands of shells rained down on American positions. Communications lines were severed, forward posts obliterated, and entire sectors plunged into confusion. Then the infantry came, then the tanks. 3 German armies, more music than 200,000 men, slamming into 4 overstretched American divisions. Units that had expected a quiet sector, even a rest cure from heavy fighting elsewhere, suddenly found themselves drowning in fire at Shaw and Bradley's headquarters. Music. Early reports were brushed off as a local counterattack. Only after hours of frantic messages did the true scale of the assault become impossible to ignore. The 106th Infantry Division, new to the front and stationed in the Ardennes for a gentle introduction to combat, was shattered. 2 of its regiments were surrounded and eventually surrendered. The largest mass capitulation of U.S. troops in the European theater. At the Third Army headquarters, the reaction was different. Patton received the initial reports, then turned to Coe. He didn't sound surprised. "You were right," he said. "What's their objective?" Coe studied the developing picture, the pattern of attacks, the direction of the thrust, the importance of road junctions. It all pointed to the same conclusion: Bastonia. From there, the Germans could drive toward the Meuse River and beyond, aiming to split the Allied armies and seize the critical port of Antwerp. Patton nodded once. "Get me General Gaffey," he ordered. "We're executing music, the contingency plans." While other commands were still arguing over what was happening, Third Army began to move. Units in the SAR started to disengage. Artillery began to shift, and traffic officers prepared to reverse the flow of men and equipment. The emergency that everyone else had just discovered was one Patton had already prepared music for. 3 days later came the conference in Verdun. Eisenhower coming. Into that meeting understood that the German attack, however dangerous, also presented an opportunity. The enemy had left strong defensive positions and was now exposed in the open. If the Allies could respond quickly, they could strike at the flanks of the German advance and turn a potential catastrophe into music, a decisive defeat for Hitler's last gamble in the West. But speed was everything. Every hour lost gave the Germans time to deepen their penetration. Around the table, generals wrestled with the cold math of distance and time. They knew how long it normally took to disengage divisions, to redirect supply lines, to reassign priorities. The idea of mounting a major counterattack within days seemed like fantasy. Then Patton made his declaration. 2 divisions ready to attack north in 48 hours, 3 in 72. Eisenhower stared at him. Patton's reputation for aggression was legendary, but this was another level. If he promised relief and failed to deliver, the 101st Airborne and Supporting units in Bastonia might be destroyed. George Ike said, "This is no time for grandstanding. Bastonia is surrounded. If we tell those men help is coming, and it doesn't arrive, they die." Patton didn't flinch. "Ike," he replied, "I've already given the orders. Third Army is disengaging now. I have 3 contingency plans ready. I've been expecting this attack for 11 days." The room absorbed that in stunned silence. The offensive that had shocked Shaw, that had shattered entire divisions, that had seemed to appear from nowhere. Patton had anticipated it. Eisenhower watched him carefully. He had known Patton for years. He knew when the man was bluffing and when he was deadly serious. This time, Patton was serious. "All right, George," Eisenhower said. "Get moving." Patton left the conference, found a telephone, and placed one call to his chief of staff at Third Army headquarters. He spoke 2 words: "Play ball." Those 2 words triggered music, the carefully constructed machinery of Coe's plans. Orders flashed through radio nets and telephone lines. Truck convoys, already organized and positioned, began loading men and equipment. Tanks and armored vehicles rolled out of their current positions, turning north on roads now crowded with southbound traffic, wounded soldiers, retreating units, and refugees. Traffic control became a high art and a brutal necessity as military police struggled to keep the columns flowing. Help us grow. Your super chats and super stickers directly support the channel and future content. The 4th Armored Division spearheaded the movement, followed by the 26th Infantry Division and other formations. Over 133,000 vehicles would be involved in the redeployment. Tanks, half-tracks, trucks, jeeps, music artillery pieces, fuel bows, and ambulances. The weather fought them every step of the way. Snow fell, roads iced over, engines froze. Men stood by stalled vehicles in numbing cold, fingers raw, faces stung by the wind. Yet the movement did not stop. Night and day, headlights crawled along narrow routes, command posts shifted, supply lines twisted and reformed to feed the new axis of advance. Other Allied commands still struggled to fully understand what was happening in the Ardennes. Some were only just beginning to organize countermeasures. Music, Third Army, by contrast, was already in motion, guided by plans that had been drawn up before the first shell had fallen. By December 21st, the lead elements of 4th Armored Division were in position for the attack toward Bastonia. They had covered more than 100 miles in less than 48 hours, disengaging from combat and redeploying in some of the worst winter weather Europe had seen in decades. What seemed like a miracle to outside observers was in reality the execution of detailed preparation. On December 22nd, Third Army launched its attack north. The drive toward Bastogne was fierce and costly. German forces had dug in along likely routes, turning villages, ridges, and crossroads into strong points. Tank battles erupted in frozen fields, muzzle flashes lighting up the snow. Infantrymen pushed forward through woods glazed with ice, every breath a cloud in the frigid air. American units advanced, were thrown back, regrouped, and pushed again. Inside Bastogne, the 101st Airborne Division and attached troops endured constant bombardment and probing attacks. Supplies dwindled. Ammunition was carefully rationed. Medical resources stretched to the limit. On December 22nd, German emissaries approached under a flag of truce and demanded the town's surrender. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, acting commander of the 101st, responded with a single famous word: nuts. The defenders held, clinging to the belief that relief was coming. 4 days later, on December 26, 1944, at 4:50 p.m., First Lieutenant Charles Bogus, commanding the Sherman tank Cobra King of 4th Armored Division, broke through the last German positions near the village of Eisenhower. His vehicle made physical contact with elements of the 101st Airborne, a literal link between the besieged and their rescuers. The siege of Bastogne had been broken by the spearhead of Patton's Third Army. Patton received the news and immediately telephoned Eisenhower. "We're through to Bastogne," he reported. The relief corridor was narrow and vulnerable, and German forces struck at its flanks repeatedly, but Third Army held the line. That night, supply trucks streamed into the shattered town, bringing ammunition, food, and medicine. The paratroopers, who had endured 8 days of isolation and relentless pressure, now had what they needed to keep fighting. The Battle of the Bulge would rage on into January. The Germans never reached the Meuse. Their timetable unraveled. Their last great offensive in the West failed. But the cost to the Americans was staggering. Over 19,000 killed, more than 47,000 wounded, and approximately 23,000 captured or missing. It was the bloodiest single battle the U.S. Army ever fought. Yet, even those terrible numbers could have been far worse. If Bastogne had fallen, if the 101st Airborne and other defenders had been overrun, German armor might have seized the vital road junction and exploited it to drive deeper west. The Allied front, music, could have split. Chaos might have rippled through command structures and supply lines. The shape of the final months of the war in Europe might have been very different. Patton's rapid counterattack didn't just rescue a town. It disrupted the entire German strategy. After the war, American officials examined the intelligence failure that had allowed the German buildup to go largely unnoticed, or rather unheeded. How had 15 divisions vanished from the order of battle without ringing alarm bells at the highest levels? How had over 200,000 German troops and massive amounts of equipment been assembled for a major offensive, while most Allied leaders remained confident the enemy was on the edge of collapse? The uncomfortable answer was that someone had noticed. Oscar Coe had music tracked those divisions. He had identified their movement. He had predicted not only a German offensive, but its likely direction and objective. His warnings were not based on hunches or guesswork, but on systematic analysis of multiple sources of information. His reports had been passed upward. Bradley had been informed Shea had received the intelligence, and yet they had all largely dismissed it. The reason was not purely incompetence, it was assumption. Many senior officers believed the war in Europe was effectively won. From that viewpoint, every new piece of data bent to fit an existing story. Germany was too weak, too depleted to mount a major offensive. Any disturbing signals were explained away as local anomalies or defensive preparations. Approached the evidence differently. He did not assume the war was nearly over. He simply asked what the facts suggested, regardless of how uncomfortable the conclusions might be. His analysis pointed to danger, not safety. Still, intelligence alone changes nothing unless a commander chooses to act on it. Koch's assessment reached multiple headquarters. Most treated it as an interesting but unlikely scenario. Only one major commander took it seriously enough to build detailed plans around it. George S. Patton. He didn't just listen to his intelligence officer, he bet the posture of his entire army on Koch's being right when almost everyone else believed he was wrong. He used precious time, staff effort, and logistical resources to prepare for a crisis that might never come. And when the crisis did come, that preparation meant that Third Army could do what no other force in the theater could. Turn on a dime and counterpunch with overwhelming speed. At Verdun, the other generals had stared in disbelief when Patton calmly promised an attack in 48 hours. To them, it sounded like another example of Patton's legendary bravado. In reality, he had been quietly putting the pieces in place for 11 days. He wasn't boasting. Music. He was simply describing what he already knew his army could do. In the official histories of the war, Third Army's relief of Bastonia is praised. But the 11 days of invisible preparation behind that achievement are often reduced to a footnote. Oscar Koch's name rarely appears outside specialized military studies. His prediction of the Ardennes offensive, one of the most accurate intelligence assessments of the conflict, was overshadowed by the broader narrative of surprise and recovery. Yet for those who study command and decision-making, the lesson music is clear and enduring. Intelligence has value only when leaders are willing to question their assumptions and act before events force their hand. Preparation is not glamorous. It doesn't come with parades or decorations. But in moments of crisis, it is the difference between improvisation and execution. The Battle of the WWII Bulge exposed a glaring failure at the highest levels of Allied intelligence, but it also highlighted a single vital distinction. Most commanders heard the same reports and concluded that Germany could not do what the evidence suggested it was preparing to do. Patton and Koch looked at the same information and prepared for the possibility that everyone else was wrong. That is why when the German offensive smashed into the Ardennes and chaos rippled along the front, Third Army stood ready to pivot. Not because Patton was reckless, not because he was lucky, because he believed in planning for the worst, even while fighting for the best outcome. Because he trusted an intelligence officer who saw what others refused music to see. In war, victories are often attributed to courage, firepower, or sheer will. All of those mattered at Bastogne. The paratroopers who said nuts, the tank crews who broke through, the infantry who trudged forward through snow and shell fire, none of it would have been possible without a commander who prepared for the unthinkable before it became reality. That is why George S. Patton was the only general truly ready for the Battle of the Bulge. And that is why, in the end, the story of Bastogne is not just about desperation and heroism, but about foresight and trust. The quiet work done 11 days before the first shot was fired. Help us grow. Your super chats and super stickers directly support the channel and future content.